Okay, in this video, I'm going to look at how to take a synthesizer that we've made and turn it into a polyphonic synthesizer. So here's a synthesizer from the last example, and as you can see, it just takes MIDI in, and it uses that to control a sine wave. So I've got the MIDI number being converted to frequency, I have the velocity being converted to a very simple ramped envelope that ramps up to a value and then back down after the note goes off, and that is going out to plug out. And it sounds like this. Great. So the problem with that is that if I make chords, I'm not going to be able to hear them. So if I make a new MIDI clip and say I want to hear chords, so I'm going to build up a C minor chord here, and I'm going to have a couple different chords so I can just hear things changing. So I'm going to have a C minor chord and then maybe an F minor chord. Let's make sure that I'm hitting all the right notes here. And then maybe I'll end on a G major chord. And maybe I'll make this G major chord last a little longer. So I'm going to call this clip chords. And if I go back here and play this, notice that I'm not hearing chords. If I move this clip over to a new MIDI track, and I use one of Live's preset instruments like operator, then I'll be able to hear the chords. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to make an instrument in Max for Live that can play multiple notes. So I'll show you how to do that now. We've got the skeleton of a synth here in this thing that I made called Simple Synth 1. And the secret to making a polyphonic synthesizer is an object called the poly object. And the poly object basically is fed a copy of a patch that will look a lot like this, and then it will automatically create more as needed. So if you play a 5-note chord, it will suddenly make 5 copies of this to play that chord. And then if that chord goes away, it'll get rid of them all. And then if you hear a 2-note chord, it'll make 2 copies, and so on and so forth. Very useful object. So the first thing to do, of course, is to create a new instrument. So here's a Max instrument. I'm going to edit it, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say save as. And I'm going to do simple poly synth 1. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to click this away and go back to Live and notice that now I have simple poly synth 1 here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do collect all and save. So I've just made a new synth, and I would like to keep it in my home folder. So notice that now, if I drill down here into the directory, I've got 2 new synths here. I have Simple Synth 1 from before, and I have Simple Poly Synth 1. So that's new. So now here's the process for taking this synth that I just made. I'm going to open it in Max, and creating a polyphonic synthesizer using it. So the secret is that the poly object needs a subpatch, and the subpatch is what contains the synthesizer. So in Max, I'm going to just open a new patcher, and I'm going to go back to my synth that I just made in the last video. I'm going to copy the main guts of it. So everything underneath MIDI in and above plug out, all of this other stuff, I'm going to copy. I'm going to paste it in here. I'm going to get rid of that, and actually MIDI parse I'm going to leave outside as well. So what I've left are the guts. I'm going to get a list with MIDI pitch and velocity coming in, and then I want sound going out. The first thing I'm going to do, sense a pattern here, is I'm going to save this. And I'm going to save this new Max patch in my folder. So I'm not going to save it in the default place that it wants me to save something. I'm going to go to the desktop and go to my folder and drill down to where these other synths live that I just made. And I'm going to call this Simple Synth 1 for poly, and I'm going to save that. Now this subpatch is in the same directory as the synthesizer that I want to use it with, and that's extremely important. So to modify this for use with the poly object, we need to do a couple of different things. We need an input here, and I'm going to use the in object, which is different than the inlets that we've seen before when making subpatches. This is a specific thing to the poly object. So information is going to come in here, and then sound is going to go out here. So I'm going to make a special out object, and it's going to be an out tilde object. So I'm going to do out tilde space 1, and I'm going to hook that up like that. And now I'm going to add another object called this poly tilde. So what's happening? Well, these ones that I'm using here, this is the first of many voices. So the poly object keeps track of a bunch of different voices and it gives them index numbers. So the example that I'm giving the poly object here is going to be for voice 1, and then it'll automatically replace these numbers with other ones on its own. But it's very important that I write in space 1 and out tilde space 1. So I'm getting data in here and I'm getting sound out here. The other thing I need to do is I'm giving a copy of that sound to this poly object. And this listens for the difference between 0 and non-zero. If something is non-zero, that means the synth is still playing, and it reserves this voice as busy. So if there's a new note that gets played, it'll have to make some new voice for that note to get played. When the note turns off, the MIDI note sends a velocity of 0, line ramps down to 0, this wave is now 0, and this poly object, seeing that this 0 is now there, it can free this voice up to take a new note if a new note happens along. So you can think of that as the way you would use fingers on a keyboard. You only have 5 fingers, so if you play more than 5 notes, you're going to have to take a finger off and move it, and this is sort of the same idea. So this is actually now complete. I'm going to save that and click it away. And this is our monophonic synth. We don't need that. I'm going to click that away. Now, here's my polyphonic synth. I'm going to make a poly object, poly tilde, and then I'm going to type exactly the name that I gave to the max patch that I just made. So I'm going to go and remind myself exactly what I called it. I called it simple synth 1 for poly. I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to do this, simple synth 1 for poly, and then I'm going to say 4. This third argument is how many of them you'll need at a time. This gives you a maximum number. I'm going to say I won't need more than 4. Now here's a little weird hiccup that happens. When you first make the poly object in the max window, you might notice that it says no patcher for simple synth 1 poly. Don't worry. All you do is press save and click this away. Go back to live, and what has happened is that this has been saved in our home folder that we made for the project, and then only after I saved it, it looked inside that folder and it saw that actually that subpatch did exist. And now notice that we have an inlet and an outlet here. So now I can open this up again in Max, and we're almost done. There's one step left, and that is that the MIDI in order for the poly object to be able to use it, it needs to be prepended with a message. So I'm going to make a prepend object and give it the argument MIDI note. And I'm going to make my MIDI parse object as before. So I'm going to have MIDI coming in, I'm going to parse it, and then I'm going to add this word MIDI note in front of that list. And now the poly object knows that this is a MIDI note. And then the rest of that list is going to get unpacked as normal. And I can hook my poly object up to plug out. I'll press save. And now I'm going to go back to live. And we should be able to hear chords now. Now notice that it was really loud. So this is a good thing to get in the habit of. Is when you make a polyphonic synth, if I double click on this, I can see the patch that the actual synthesizer is. And I can modify this by unlocking it. And it's generally a good idea before the output to simply scale this thing. So I'm going to multiply tilde, because it's a sound wave, and I'm going to multiply this by 0.25. So now, even if I have 4 voices playing, they'll still only add up to 1. I'm going to save that. Save that. And now, look what happens. If I play this, it's a much better volume. If I bring the slider back up to normal, this is a reasonable level. So there is a polyphonic synthesizer. As usual, I'm just going to do collect all and save, just to make double sure that everything is where it should be. And look, here's my home folder. Now I have my 2 synthesizers plus my sub patch for the polyphonic synth. And I'm good to go. I can zip all of that up, like so. I can right click and do compress. And I'll get this little zip file and I can email that to myself or send it to a friend. And as long as they have live, they can open it up and play my polyphonic synthesizer.